Welcome back. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to go over a comparison of reduction and oxidation. Okay? And there's different ways to look at reduction and oxidation depending on what kind of system you're dealing with. All right? One way to look at it is, are you dealing with a system where charges are just intrinsically given? A good example of that is more in the inorganic side. Okay? If you have, for example, over here, iron 3+, all right? The charge of that atom is given, 3+. And so if it changes to 4+ or 2+, we can classify it easily that way. Some things, however, more from the organic or biological perspective, you don't have charges like these down here. I just have simple organic molecules. And if you don't know the rules, it can be more difficult to tell whether or not those are going to be oxidations or reductions because no charges are given. But it turns out depending on the system you have, there are different rules. So first let's go over the rule for metals, or things in general where the charges are given. Okay? Alright, so if I have charges like on metals given, I'm going to start with reduction. If I go from iron 3+ to iron 2+, that's a reduction. Now how do I know that? Well, first of all, it's called reduction generally because the charge was reduced. It went from 3 to 2. Okay? So reduction is always going to be a decrease in charge. Okay? But that also corresponds to an increase in the number of electrons. Because if I take this iron 3+ and I add 1 electron to that, that's what reduces it into the 2+ state. Okay? So always reduction for transition metals and things like that is a decrease in charge, also an increase in the number of electrons in an atom. Okay? Oxidation is the opposite. An example here, I have molybdenum 4+, and it goes up in charge to molybdenum 6+. So oxidation is going to be an increase in charge, and it's going to lose electrons. So molybdenum 4+ lost 2 electrons. Okay? Now, one of the reasons oxidation is called oxidation is because the tendency is when something loses electrons, a lot of the times it's losing them to oxygen, thus oxidation. Because a lot of times things lose electrons to oxygen because oxygen is a very good electron removing substance. Okay? It's a good reducing agent, oxidant. Okay? That's why it's called oxidation. But in any case, reduction, decrease in charge, increase the number of electrons. Oxidation, increase the charge and decrease the number of electrons. When you start dealing with organic type of molecules, it becomes a little bit more complicated. Okay, now notice I have the same molecules drawn here, but here it's going this direction, the arrows. Here we're starting here and going this direction, all right? So here's what I want to look at. In each of these, I'm looking specifically at the carbon atom right here, all right? Now, if you haven't taken organic, don't worry so much about this. This is what we're going to do. On each of these, what I'd like to do is on each carbon for each number, I want to count, ultimately, the number of hydrogens and oxygens bound to that carbon. How many bonds? Not the number of atoms, but the number of bonds. So for number 1, for carbon dioxide, how many bonds are there to oxygen? Well, there's 4. There's 2 sigma bonds and 2 pi bonds. So there's 4 bonds to oxygen. And how many bonds to hydrogen? 0. All right? Now, in this case, number 2, that's acetic acid, that carbon that's red, how many bonds to oxygen? It's 3. How many bonds to hydrogen? Well, it's still 0, all right? But now for acetaldehyde, how many bonds to oxygen do we have? 2. How many bonds to hydrogen? 1, this hydrogen over here. For ethanol, how many bonds to oxygen? 1. How many bonds to hydrogen? Well, there's 2 here, so 2 bonds. And then for ethane, how many bonds to oxygen? 0. And how many bonds to hydrogen? Well, there's 3 of them here, so 3. So when we're talking about, up here, reduction, all this direction in here, this is reduction. That is very messy. Let me go back in. So this in here is reduction. So what would be a general rule for reduction? Well, for pretty much for every atom, that is, When something gets reduced, it has a decrease in the bonds to oxygen and generally an increase in the bonds to hydrogen. Okay, so if you're adding hydrogens to something and you're taking away oxygen bonds, that's probably a reduction. Okay, let's look at oxidation. So number one, and again, I'm going to look at the same atoms here. Okay, let me just change my color. We're looking at this carbon right here, and I want to do the same thing, except we're going to go the reverse direction. All right? Let's start with 1 down here, ethane. How many bonds to oxygen there? 0. And how many bonds to hydrogen? 3. Here's ethanol. How many bonds to oxygen? 1. And then there's 2 bonds to hydrogen. For acetaldehyde, how many bonds to oxygen? 2. And then there's 1 bond to hydrogen. Acetic acid, how many bonds to oxygen? 3. And how many bonds to hydrogen? 0. And then carbon dioxide, bonds to oxygen, 4. And there's no bonds to hydrogen. So this direction is what? Oxidation. What would be a general rule for oxidation? Well, we're increasing bonds to oxygen and we're decreasing bonds to hydrogen. Okay? So that's going to be an important rule of thumb to remember, especially when we start dealing with organic molecules. It's very important to be able to identify whether something's an oxidation or a reduction. So I hope this video made some sense. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for future videos and notifications. Thank you very much.